October 15, 2007 began like any other autumn Monday in Rockford, Oregon. The small logging town, nestled between dense forests and the winding Cascade River, was experiencing the first truly cold morning of the season. Frost covered the ground as students made their way to Rockford High School, among them 14-year-old Bryce Mitchell. Bryce was known around town as a bright, if somewhat reserved teenager. A sophomore with a talent for mathematics and photography, he had recently joined the school's yearbook committee. That Monday morning, Bryce attended all his morning classes, according to the attendance records. Security footage from the school cafeteria showed him eating lunch alone at 12:15 p.m., which wasn't unusual for the introspective teen. The last confirmed sighting of Bryce was at 2:47 p.m., when a hall monitor's body camera briefly captured him walking toward the east exit of the building after the final bell. By 6:30 p.m., Bryce's mother, Diane Mitchell, had called the Rockford Police Department to report that her son hadn't returned home. Initially, officers suggested that Bryce might be at a friend's house or had lost track of time, a common occurrence with teenagers. But Diane insisted this was completely out of character for her son, who always texted if he was going to be late. Bryce was responsible beyond his years, recalled Officer Peter Clancy, who took the initial missing persons report. His mother made it clear that him not coming home or calling was unprecedented. That's when we started to take the situation more seriously. At 8:45 p.m., Reed Lester, Bryce's stepfather of 3 years, returned home from his job as a regional sales manager for a timber equipment company. According to the initial police report, Lester appeared concerned, but suggested that Bryce might be acting out due to recent arguments about his grades and phone privileges. Nevertheless, he joined Diane in calling Bryce's few close friends, none of whom had seen him after school. The first crucial piece of evidence came at 11:23 p.m. when Diane discovered that Bryce's savings account card was missing from his desk drawer. Bank records would later show that $40 had been withdrawn from an ATM at Miller's gas station at 3:22 p.m., just 35 minutes after Bryce was last seen at school. The gas station was located in the opposite direction from the Mitchell-Lester home. By morning, the Rockford Police Department had officially classified Bryce as a missing person. Chief Thomas Whalen authorized the use of search dogs, and volunteers from the community began combing the wooded areas between the high school and the Mitchell-Lester residence. Local news stations picked up the story, broadcasting Bryce's school photo across Oregon State. The first 48 hours in any missing persons case are critical, explained Chief Whalen in a press conference on October 16th. We're exploring all possibilities, from runaway to abduction, but we're especially concerned given Bryce's age and the fact that he has no history of disappearing or behavioral issues. The investigation took a concerning turn on the afternoon of October 17th, when a search volunteer discovered Bryce's backpack in an isolated area of Cascade River State Park, approximately 3 miles from Rockford High School. The backpack contained Bryce's school books, his photography assignment, and a half-eaten sandwich from his lunch. Notably absent were his phone, wallet, and the distinctive red jacket he had been wearing when last seen at school. The discovery shifted the investigation's tone dramatically. The remote location of the backpack, well off any established trails, immediately raised red flags for investigators. Search dogs were brought to the scene, but lost any scent trail near the park's western parking lot, suggesting Bryce, or someone carrying his belongings, had left the area by vehicle. Finding the backpack in that location was immediately troubling, said Detective Vanessa Holt, who would later become the lead investigator on the case. It wasn't on a path from school to anywhere. Someone had to deliberately go deep into those woods to leave it there. As the search intensified, differences in how Bryce's parents responded to the disappearance began to emerge. Diane Mitchell appeared desperate for answers, rarely sleeping and constantly checking her phone for updates. She provided investigators with detailed information about Bryce's routines, friends, and recent behavior. In contrast, Reed Lester maintained what several officers described as an unusually composed demeanor. He participated in the searches, but often returned home early, citing work obligations. On October 18th, the third day of Bryce's disappearance, police interviewed Jason Cooper, one of Bryce's few close friends. Cooper revealed that Bryce had recently confided in him about increasing tensions at home, particularly with his stepfather. According to Cooper, Bryce had mentioned that Reed had been going through his things and seemed bothered by Bryce's close relationship with his biological father, who lived in Seattle. Bryce told me that Reed had been acting weird around him, Cooper told investigators. Like getting mad over small stuff and always questioning where he was going. Bryce was saving money to visit his real dad over Christmas break, but he didn't want Reed to know about it. This information prompted investigators to take a closer look at the family dynamics. They learned that Diane and Bryce's biological father, Martin Mitchell, had divorced when Bryce was 9 years old. Martin had moved to Seattle for work, but maintained regular contact with his son through weekend visits and phone calls. Reed Lester had entered the picture when Bryce was 11, marrying Diane after a 6-month courtship. By the end of the first week, the search area had expanded to cover much of Rockford County. Flyers with Bryce's photo appeared in store windows and on telephone poles throughout western Oregon. The FBI was brought in to assist, providing additional resources and expertise in cases of missing minors. On October 21st, exactly 1 week after Bryce's disappearance, a development occurred that would later prove significant. A park ranger at Cascade River State Park, reviewing footage from recently installed wildlife monitoring cameras, noticed a dark SUV entering the park at 9:47 p.m. on the night of October 15th, several hours after Bryce was last seen. The vehicle's license plate wasn't visible in the low-quality footage, but investigators noted that Reed Lester drove a dark blue Ford Explorer. When questioned about his whereabouts that evening, Lester stated that he had been on a business trip to Portland and hadn't returned to Rockford until after 8:30 p.m. He claimed to have gone straight home upon his return. Credit card records confirmed a gas purchase in Portland at 4:18 p.m., but there was no digital trail of his movements between then and his arrival home. As October turned to November, hope of finding Bryce alive began to fade. The case remained active, but with few new leads, the intensity of the search diminished. Diane Mitchell, however, refused to give up. She established the Find Bryce Mitchell Foundation, organizing weekly search parties and maintaining media attention on her son's disappearance. The most perplexing aspect of the case was the complete absence of digital footprint after Bryce's disappearance. His phone never connected to any cell towers after 3 p.m. on October 15th. His email and social media accounts remained untouched. The $40 ATM withdrawal was the last activity on his bank account. It was as if Bryce had simply vanished. Detective Vanessa Holt, now fully assigned to the case, began to focus more intently on the timeline of events and the people closest to Bryce. Something about Reed Lester's alibi wasn't sitting right with her. The Portland trip checked out, but the timing left a window of opportunity that troubled her. Moreover, as she reviewed the initial interviews with family members, inconsistencies in Lester's statements began to emerge. In late November, another piece of evidence surfaced that would eventually prove crucial. A highway maintenance worker found a smartphone in a drainage ditch along Interstate 5, approximately 20 miles north of Rockford. The device, severely damaged by water exposure, was identified as Bryce's iPhone through its serial number. The location was notable. It was along the direct route between Rockford and Portland, where Reed Lester claimed to have been traveling for work on the day of the disappearance. Digital forensics experts were unable to recover much data from the waterlogged phone, but they did determine that it had been powered off at 3:17 p.m. on October 15th, just minutes after Bryce was last seen leaving school. The location data was too corrupted to establish where the phone had been when it was last active. As winter settled over Rockford, the case of Bryce Mitchell remained unsolved, but beneath the surface, Detective Holt was methodically building a case that would eventually unravel the truth behind the teenager's disappearance. The scattered evidence, the backpack in the state park, the nighttime SUV sighting, the discarded phone along the interstate, would eventually connect to form a disturbing picture. And at the center of it all was Reed Lester, a stepfather whose carefully constructed alibi was about to collapse under the weight of one crucial piece of evidence that investigators hadn't yet discovered. Security camera footage from a remote gas station that would expose the terrible truth about what happened to Bryce Mitchell on that cold October afternoon. As winter gripped Rockford with unusually heavy snowfall, the investigation into Bryce Mitchell's disappearance faced mounting challenges. Detective Vanessa Holt, a 15-year veteran of the Rockford Police Department with a reputation for methodical thoroughness, formally took charge of the case in December 2007. Known for solving cold cases that others had abandoned, Holt's first action was to establish a precise timeline of events surrounding October 15th. Cases like these are won or lost in the details, Holt explained in a later interview. I needed to account for every minute of that day, every person who interacted with Bryce, and every inconsistency in the witness statements. Holt began by re-interviewing everyone who had seen Bryce on the day of his disappearance. She discovered that Bryce's math teacher, Eleanor Prentice, had noticed something unusual that morning. According to Prentice, Bryce had seemed distracted during class and had checked his phone repeatedly, behavior out of character for the typically attentive student. When Prentice asked him if everything was all right, Bryce had simply nodded and put his phone away. Phone records would later reveal that Bryce had received 3 text messages from his stepfather during that class period, which Reed Lester had not mentioned in his initial statements to police. Another crucial testimony came from Marcus Jennings, a school bus driver whose route passed near Miller's gas station, where Bryce had withdrawn money from the ATM. Jennings recalled seeing a teenager matching Bryce's description standing near the gas station's payphone around 3:30 p.m., apparently waiting for someone. This sighting, if accurate, occurred just minutes after the ATM withdrawal and contradicted the theory that Bryce had headed toward the state park immediately after school. The payphone detail particularly interested me, Holt noted. In 2007, most teenagers relied on cell phones. Using a payphone suggested Bryce might have been concerned about his calls being traced or monitored. Phone records confirmed that a 3-minute call had been placed from that payphone to Martin Mitchell, Bryce's biological father in Seattle, at 3:28 p.m. When interviewed, Martin stated that Bryce had called to ask if he could come stay with him for a while, mentioning problems at home, but not elaborating before abruptly ending the call. Martin had tried calling Bryce's cell phone afterward, but received no answer. He assumed Bryce would call back later and became alarmed only when Diane contacted him about their son's disappearance. This information shifted Holt's perspective on the case. If Bryce had been planning to leave town, possibly to stay with his father, why would his backpack be found deep in the state park? And why would he abandon these plans so suddenly after calling his father? In January 2008, Holt began to focus more intensely on the family dynamics within the Mitchell-Lester household. Interviews with neighbors and teachers revealed a pattern of increasing tension. Bryce had gone from being an outgoing, confident child to a more withdrawn teenager in the 2 years since Reed Lester had married his mother. Several of Diane's friends noted that she seemed different after her marriage to Reed, more anxious and less social. There was nothing obvious like visible bruises or direct complaints, said Teresa Whitman, Diane's longtime friend and colleague. But Diane changed after Reed came into the picture. She was always checking in with him, always worried about getting home on time. Bryce seemed to retreat into himself too. Holt also discovered that Reed Lester had a history that hadn't been fully explored during the initial investigation. Before moving to Oregon 5 years earlier, Lester had lived in Nevada, where he had been married to a woman named Allison Garrett. Their marriage had ended abruptly, with Garrett filing for divorce and a temporary restraining order, though the latter was later dismissed when Lester moved out of state. When Holt contacted Garrett, she described Lester as controlling and obsessed with money. "He kept detailed records of every penny I spent," Garrett told Holt. "He'd explode over the smallest purchases if they weren't pre-approved by him. When my teenage son from my first marriage came to live with us, Reed couldn't handle sharing any attention or resources. That's when things really deteriorated." This portrait of Reed Lester contrasted sharply with the composed, cooperative stepfather he had presented himself as during the investigation. It also provided a possible motive for tension with Bryce, financial control, and resentment of his stepson's place in Diane's life and budget. In February 2008, Holt made another significant discovery. Reviewing Bryce's school records, she found that he had recently been awarded a prestigious summer photography internship in Seattle, near his father's home. The acceptance letter had arrived just 3 days before his disappearance. More tellingly, school counselor records showed that Bryce had discussed potentially living with his father permanently after the summer to attend a specialized arts high school in Seattle. When questioned about this, Diane Mitchell confirmed that Bryce had mentioned the internship, but said they hadn't discussed any permanent move to Seattle. Reed Lester claimed complete ignorance of both the internship and any plans for Bryce to relocate. However, email records later recovered from the family computer showed that Lester had opened and read the acceptance email before Bryce had even seen it. By spring 2008, the investigation seemed to be at a standstill. Despite the suspicious circumstances surrounding Reed Lester, there was no concrete evidence linking him directly to Bryce's disappearance. The case gained new momentum in April when FBI Special Agent Troy Navarro joined the investigation. Navarro specialized in digital forensics and behavioral analysis. His first contribution was a complete reconstruction of Reed Lester's movements on October 15th using cell tower data, a technique that was becoming more refined but was still not routinely used in smaller jurisdictions like Rockford. The analysis revealed something startling. While Lester's phone had indeed been in Portland, as he claimed, it had then traveled back toward Rockford earlier than he had admitted, placing him near the Cascade River State Park around the time the dark SUV had been captured on the wildlife cameras. The phone had then been powered off for approximately 3 hours before reactivating near his home in Rockford. When confronted with this information, Lester claimed he had returned early from his Portland trip but had stopped to take a nap at a rest area because he was tired, something he hadn't mentioned before because he didn't think it was relevant. He claimed his phone had died during this time. That explanation didn't hold water, Agent Navarro stated. The cell data showed movement consistent with someone driving to specific locations during the time his phone was supposedly dead, and the locations aligned perfectly with where key evidence in Bryce's disappearance had been found. In May 2008, investigators executed a search warrant on Reed Lester's Ford Explorer. Although the vehicle had been thoroughly cleaned, forensic technicians discovered microscopic blood traces in the cargo area carpet that had seeped beneath the plastic liner. DNA testing confirmed it was Bryce's blood. When presented with this evidence, Lester claimed that Bryce had cut himself while loading camping equipment weeks earlier. Despite these damning findings, prosecutors were reluctant to file charges without more conclusive evidence. Ideally, Bryce's remains or an eyewitness. The case had become what investigators sometimes call a one-mile case. They knew who was responsible, but needed to travel the final, crucial mile to make an airtight case that would stand up in court. That summer, the investigation hit another obstacle when Diane Mitchell, who had been increasingly questioning her husband's possible involvement, died in what was ruled an accidental overdose of prescription sleeping medication. Though investigated thoroughly, no evidence of foul play was found. Toxicology reports indicated she had also consumed alcohol, which dangerously amplified the medication's effects. With Diane's death, Reed Lester inherited the family home and her life insurance policy. He quickly sold the house and moved to Idaho, claiming he needed a fresh start after the dual tragedies of losing his stepson and wife. The move complicated the investigation as it crossed jurisdictional boundaries and stretched the already limited resources assigned to Bryce's case. By the end of 2008, the case was in danger of going cold. Detective Holt and Agent Navarro remained convinced of Lester's guilt, but lacked the smoking gun needed for an arrest. The crucial breakthrough would come from an unexpected source and would have to wait for advances in technology that weren't yet available to the investigation team. "We knew we were missing something," Holt recalled. "Some piece of evidence that would tie everything together. I kept thinking about that gas station where Bryce had withdrawn money. If he met someone there, if that someone was Reed Lester, there had to be some record of it." What Holt didn't know was that Miller's gas station wasn't the only filling station in the area. 3 miles further down the rural highway was Pearson's Truck Stop, a facility primarily used by long-haul truckers that had installed a new security system just weeks before Bryce's disappearance. Those cameras had captured footage that would eventually break the case wide open, once investigators knew to look for it. As 2009 began, the case file for Bryce Mitchell grew thick with leads, theories, and circumstantial evidence. But somewhere in those thousands of pages, overlooked by tired eyes and missed during canvassing, was the name of a truck driver who had seen something crucial on that October afternoon. A witness whose testimony would eventually lead investigators to the security footage that captured Reed Lester's Ford Explorer, with what appeared to be a passenger matching Bryce's description, traveling toward a remote property that Lester would purchase just 3 months after his stepson's disappearance. The technical breakthrough needed to enhance and analyze this grainy security footage wouldn't be available to the Rockford Police Department until 2009. By then, Reed Lester had established a new life in Idaho, believing he had gotten away with the perfect crime. But Detective Vanessa Holt hadn't forgotten Bryce Mitchell, and she was about to get the evidence she needed to finally bring his killer to justice. 6 months after Bryce Mitchell's disappearance, the investigation had reached what many considered a dead end. The case file had grown to over 3,000 pages of witness statements, forensic reports, and detective notes, but the crucial link needed to file charges against Reed Lester remained elusive. For Detective Vanessa Holt, however, the case had become something close to an obsession. "There's a moment in every difficult investigation where you have a choice," Holt would later explain. "You can accept that some cases don't get solved, or you can keep pushing against those closed doors until one of them gives way." In April 2008, Holt made a decision that would eventually change the course of the investigation. Instead of focusing solely on the day of Bryce's disappearance, she began examining Reed Lester's activities in the months before and after October 15, 2007. Financial records revealed a pattern that raised immediate red flags. 3 months before Bryce vanished, Lester had taken out a $250,000 life insurance policy on his stepson, naming himself as the sole beneficiary. When questioned about this, Lester claimed it was part of a family financial planning package that included policies for all household members. However, further investigation showed that while policies did exist for both Lester and Diane, Bryce's policy carried a premium 10 times higher than what would be typical for a healthy teenager. Even more suspicious was a series of large withdrawals Lester had made from his and Diane's joint savings account in the weeks leading up to Bryce's disappearance, totaling nearly $45,000. When initially questioned about these transactions during a voluntary interview, Lester claimed he had been planning to surprise Diane with a cabin property as an anniversary gift. No record of such a purchase was ever found. "The financial angle completely changed our understanding of motive," said FBI agent Troy Navarro. "We'd been looking at this primarily as a case of family tension and control. Now we had to consider that it might have been premeditated for financial gain." In July 2008, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Allison Garrett, Lester's ex-wife from Nevada, contacted Detective Holt with new information. After hearing about the investigation from a mutual acquaintance, Garrett remembered something disturbing from her marriage to Lester. "He used to talk about how easy it would be to make someone disappear in the woods," Garrett told investigators. "He had this detailed scenario about how if you weighted a body down in certain lakes, it would never surface. I thought it was just dark talk from a true crime show he watched, but now I'm not so sure." More critically, Garrett revealed that during their divorce proceedings, Lester had briefly discussed moving to Oregon because of its extensive wilderness areas and relatively limited law enforcement resources in rural regions. This suggested a level of premeditation that alarmed investigators, the possibility that Lester had selected Rockford specifically for its suitability as a location to commit a crime. By August 2008, Holt had compiled enough circumstantial evidence to convince her superiors to allocate additional resources to the case. A specialized search team with cadaver dogs was deployed to systematically examine the areas around Cascade River State Park again. Meanwhile, Agent Navarro began a detailed analysis of Lester's internet search history from the family computer that had been seized during the initial investigation. The search history revealed disturbing patterns. In the months before Bryce's disappearance, Lester had researched topics including decomposition rates in water, unidentified bodies statistics, and countries with no extradition to US. Even more damning were searches for how to disable iPhone tracking and can police trace deleted text messages in the days immediately preceding October 15th. The search history painted a picture of someone methodically planning a crime, Navarro explained. These weren't casual inquiries, they were specific technical questions about how to avoid detection and eliminate evidence. Despite these revelations, prosecutors remained reluctant to file charges without physical evidence linking Lester directly to Bryce's disappearance, or ideally, the recovery of Bryce's remains. The case stalled again following Diane Mitchell's death in summer 2008, with resources being temporarily diverted to investigate whether her fatal overdose might have been related to Bryce's case. By September 2008, Reed Lester had relocated to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, where he quickly established himself in the local business community. He began dating a local widow with a substantial inheritance and within months had moved into her lakefront home. To all appearances, he had moved on from the tragedies in Rockford and was building a new life. The investigation might have ended there, relegated to the cold case files, if not for two critical developments that occurred almost simultaneously in early 2009. First, the Rockford Police Department received a federal grant to implement advanced digital forensics capabilities, including software that could enhance and analyze low-quality surveillance footage. Second, a long-haul truck driver named Malcolm Reynolds came forward with information that he had initially dismissed as irrelevant. Reynolds, who regularly used Pearson's truck stop on Highway 20 outside Rockford, recalled seeing a man and teenager in what appeared to be an argument in the parking lot on the afternoon of October 15, 2007. Reynolds hadn't thought much of it at the time. Disagreements between parents and teens weren't uncommon. He had only connected it to the Mitchell case after seeing a renewed appeal for information on a trucking industry bulletin board in January 2009. The kid looked upset, like he was trying to get away from the situation, Reynolds told Detective Holt. The man kept grabbing his arm, trying to get him into a dark-colored SUV. I almost went over to see if everything was okay, but then the kid seemed to give up and got in the vehicle. Reynolds couldn't positively identify either person from photographs, but his description of the man as tall with salt and pepper hair and wearing a brown leather jacket matched Reed Lester. More importantly, Reynolds mentioned that the incident had occurred directly beneath one of the truck stop's newly installed security cameras. Pearson's truck stop had upgraded its security system just weeks before Bryce's disappearance. The system included digital cameras with a 60-day storage capacity before files were automatically overwritten. Because the truck stop hadn't been included in the initial canvass of businesses along Highway 20, investigators had focused on establishments closer to the school and Miller's gas station. The footage had never been requested during the active investigation. By the time Reynolds came forward, the original recordings were long gone. However, the truck stop owner, Harold Pearson, revealed that following a series of diesel thefts in November 2007, he had preserved segments of footage from October and November as potential evidence. Those archived files had been stored on an external hard drive and forgotten after the theft stopped. I completely forgot we still had those old files, Pearson admitted. They weren't organized by date or anything, just dumped into a folder labeled Security Backups. Could be nothing useful there, but you're welcome to check. Agent Navarro spent 3 weeks painstakingly analyzing the fragmented video files. Most were corrupted or showed nothing of interest, but on February 17, 2009, he found what investigators had been searching for: 42 seconds of footage from camera 3, time-stamped October 15, 2007, 3:52 p.m., showing the parking area behind the truck stop. The grainy footage showed a dark blue Ford Explorer with distinctive aftermarket wheels that matched Lester's vehicle. A man fitting Lester's description exited the driver's side and walked around to open the passenger door. A slender figure that appeared to be a teenage male emerged reluctantly. The two walked toward the rear of the vehicle, partially obscured from view, where what looked like a brief struggle occurred before both individuals returned to the camera's range. The teenager appeared to be limping slightly as they moved toward the building's rear entrance, which led to the restrooms. 4 minutes later, only the adult returned to the vehicle, glanced around the parking lot and drove away. Using the newly acquired enhancement software, Navarro was able to isolate several frames that clearly showed the adult male's face, unmistakably Reed Lester, and a partial image of the teenager's profile that family members later confirmed was consistent with Bryce's features. Most crucially, the vehicle's license plate was visible in one enhanced frame, confirming it was Lester's Ford Explorer. That footage was the turning point, Detective Holt recalled. I'd placed Reed Lester with Bryce at a location he claimed never to have visited, at a time when he claimed to be in Portland, and showed what appeared to be a physical altercation. More importantly, it showed Bryce entering that restroom area with Lester, but never coming out. The truck stop footage galvanized the investigation. Search warrants were immediately issued for the truck stop restrooms and surrounding areas, but after 16 months, any physical evidence had long since been removed or degraded beyond recovery. However, the video evidence was enough for investigators to obtain a more extensive search warrant for a property that had recently come to their attention. In January 2008, 3 months after Bryce's disappearance and while still living with Diane in Rockford, Reed Lester had purchased a remote 15-acre parcel of land near Fossil, Oregon, approximately 150 miles east of Rockford. The property, largely undeveloped except for a small hunting cabin, had been paid for in cash through a private sale that didn't appear in Lester's financial records reviewed earlier in the investigation. Investigators discovered the property through a newly established database that cross-referenced land transactions across Oregon counties. The timing of the purchase, the cash payment, and the remote location immediately raised suspicions. More tellingly, cell tower data showed that Lester's phone had been in the vicinity of this property for several hours on the night of October 15, 2007, during the period when his phone had supposedly been turned off while he napped at a rest area. On March 5, 2009, a team including Detective Holt, Agent Navarro, forensic specialists, and cadaver dogs converged on the fossil property. The small cabin showed signs of recent habitation, though neighbors reported that visits by the owner were infrequent and brief, typically just 1 or 2 nights every few months. The most significant discovery came on the second day of the search. Near a dry creek bed approximately 400 yards from the cabin, cadaver dogs alerted to an area where the ground appeared to have been disturbed and subsequently covered with large rocks and native vegetation in an apparent effort to disguise human intervention. Excavation of the site revealed a shallow grave containing human remains later confirmed through dental records to be those of Bryce Mitchell. Forensic examination indicated blunt force trauma to the skull as the likely cause of death. Also recovered from the gravesite were fragments of clothing matching what Bryce had been wearing when last seen, including his distinctive red jacket and a wristwatch that had been a gift from his biological father. Most damning of all, a shovel found in the cabin's storage shed contained soil samples that matched the gravesite, and its handle yielded fingerprints confirmed to be Reed Lester's. Inside the cabin, investigators discovered a locked metal box containing Bryce's cell phone, wallet, and school ID, items that should have been impossible for Lester to possess if his claims of no involvement were true. The evidence from the fossil property moved this from a circumstantial case to an overwhelming one, said District Attorney Eleanor Simmons, who would later lead the prosecution. We had video placing Lester with Bryce shortly before his disappearance, cell data tracking Lester to the burial location, the murder weapon with his fingerprints, and the victim's personal effects in his possession. It was no longer a question of if Reed Lester would be charged, but when and how we would bring him into custody. On March 12, 2009, a multi-agency team arrived at Reed Lester's new residence in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, with an arrest warrant for first-degree murder. The man, who had lived freely for 17 months since Bryce's disappearance, was taken into custody without incident, appearing shocked that investigators had finally connected all the dots. As Lester was transported back to Oregon to face charges, Detective Vanessa Holt began the difficult process of notifying Martin Mitchell that his son's remains had been found. The investigation had reached its most crucial phase, but the most revealing information was yet to come. During a lengthy interrogation, confronted with the overwhelming evidence against him, Reed Lester would finally reveal the twisted motivations that had led him to murder his 14-year-old stepson on that cold October afternoon. By March 2009, the case against Reed Lester had transformed from a collection of suspicious circumstances to a formidable body of evidence. After his arrest in Coeur d'Alene, Lester was extradited to Oregon and held without bail at the Rockford County Detention Center. As the prosecution built its case, technological advances unavailable during the initial investigation began to play a pivotal role in piecing together the final hours of Bryce Mitchell's life. Technology evolves faster than many people realize, explained digital forensics expert Dr. Sofia Ramirez, who consulted on the case. What was impossible to detect or recover in 2007 became feasible by 2009. The digital breadcrumbs people leave behind have a way of persisting, even when they think they've erased them. The most significant technological breakthrough came from advanced analysis of the security footage from Pearson's truck stop. The initial discovery of the 42-second clip showing Lester and Bryce had been crucial, but it represented only a fraction of the data stored on Harold Pearson's external hard drive. Agent Troy Navarro suspected that additional footage might exist in corrupted or fragmented files that standard recovery methods couldn't access. In April 2009, the FBI brought in Dr. Ramirez, whose team had developed proprietary algorithms specifically designed to reconstruct damaged video files. Using this cutting-edge technology, they recovered an additional 7 minutes of footage from multiple cameras at the truck stop, creating a much more comprehensive timeline of events. The reconstructed footage revealed Lester's Ford Explorer arriving at the truck stop at 3:47 p.m., just 25 minutes after Bryce had withdrawn money from the ATM at Miller's gas station 3 miles away. Camera 5, which covered the front entrance, showed Bryce entering the truck stop alone at 3:49 p.m., appearing to look around nervously before making a brief call from a payphone near the entrance. Phone records confirmed this was a call to his friend Jason Cooper that lasted just 32 seconds, too short for a conversation, but long enough to leave a message. That phone call proved critical, Detective Holt noted. Cooper had checked his voicemail days after Bryce disappeared and found a message he'd initially dismissed as a pocket dial or prank. When we retrieved it from the phone company's archives, we could hear Bryce whispering something that sounded like, "He found me," before the call abruptly ended. The footage then showed Reed Lester entering through the same doors approximately 2 minutes later, scanning the interior before spotting Bryce. Their interaction inside the truck stop was partially captured on camera too, which covered the convenience store area. The body language was telling. Bryce appeared startled and backed away, while Lester gestured emphatically toward the exit. No audio existed, but a cashier who had been working that day recalled hearing a man telling a teenager that, "Your mother is worried sick," and "We need to go now." The most disturbing footage came from camera 7, which covered a side exit leading to the rear parking area. This camera captured Lester gripping Bryce's upper arm tightly as they exited the building, with the teenager clearly trying to pull away. As they approached the Explorer, Bryce broke free and attempted to run back toward the main building, but Lester caught him, covering what appeared to be a scream with his hand before forcing him into the vehicle. "That footage was devastating," Prosecutor Eleanor Simmons said. "It showed beyond any doubt that this wasn't a voluntary departure. Bryce was trying to escape from his stepfather, who physically overpowered him and forced him into that SUV. The enhanced video quality also allowed investigators to observe previously unnoticed details. Most significantly, as Lester drove away from the truck stop, the Explorer's rear license plate was clearly visible. It matched Lester's vehicle registration, but featured a temporary paper tag in the window, something not present in photos of the vehicle taken during the initial investigation in 2007. This suggested Lester had deliberately obscured or changed his plates before arriving at the truck stop, indicating premeditation. Armed with this new timeline, investigators re-examined cell tower data for both Bryce's and Lester's phones. Bryce's phone had connected to a tower near Miller's gas station at 3:22 p.m., consistent with his ATM withdrawal. It then connected to a tower covering Pearson's truck stop area at 3:46 p.m., before going offline permanently at 4:08 p.m. Lester's phone showed connections to towers tracking a path from his workplace toward Rockford, then to the truck stop area, followed by a route heading east toward the remote property in Fossil, where Bryce's remains were eventually found. The cell data painted a clear picture, Agent Navarro explained. Lester left work early, intercepted Bryce at the truck stop, and then drove directly to the isolated property where he had already planned to dispose of the body. There was nothing spontaneous about this crime. Perhaps the most technically impressive breakthrough came from forensic analysis of the Explorer itself. Although Lester had sold the vehicle in late 2008 after moving to Idaho, investigators located it at a used car dealership in Spokane, Washington. Despite the new owner's thorough cleaning, advanced luminol testing revealed traces of blood in patterns consistent with a struggle in the passenger area. More telling were microscopic fragments of soil embedded deep in the vehicle's tire treads that matched the unique mineral composition of the Fossil property, placing the vehicle at the burial site. The digital investigation extended beyond video footage and cell data. In May 2009, forensic accountants uncovered the financial motive behind Bryce's murder in greater detail. Beyond the life insurance policy taken out 3 months before the disappearance, they discovered that Lester had been systematically embezzling from his employer, Cascade Timber Equipment, where he had worked as regional sales manager. Company financial records revealed discrepancies in equipment sales commissions totaling over $180,000 during the 2 years Lester had worked there. He had created phantom sales to non-existent clients, collecting commissions on equipment that was never delivered. The scheme was beginning to unravel in early October 2007, with the company's annual audit scheduled for November 1st. Financial pressure is one of the most common motives for family homicides, explained FBI financial crimes specialist Andrea Torres. Lester was looking at potential criminal charges for the embezzlement. He needed a large cash infusion quickly, and Bryce's life insurance policy provided that opportunity. Email records recovered from Lester's work computer showed he had received a message from the company's financial controller on October 12, 2007, 3 days before Bryce's disappearance, requesting clarification on several suspicious transactions. This timing suggested that Lester's scheme was about to be exposed, creating urgent financial pressure. By June 2009, investigators had assembled a comprehensive digital trail showing not only Lester's movements on the day of Bryce's disappearance, but also the extensive planning that preceded it. Internet search history from the family computer showed that Lester had researched isolated properties in eastern Oregon as early as August 2007. He had also searched for information on teenage runaway statistics, how long before missing person declared dead, and collecting life insurance without body. The digital evidence showed methodical planning over months, Detective Holt said. This wasn't a crime of passion or a momentary lapse in judgment. Reed Lester had calculated exactly how he would kill his stepson and profit from his death. The most chilling discovery came from a secure email account Lester had created using a public library computer. In drafts never sent but saved to the account, investigators found what appeared to be a checklist titled October 15th Timeline, with entries including intercept at gas station, administer sedative, transport to site, and complete before 7 p.m. This digital smoking gun, created 2 weeks before Bryce's disappearance, removed any doubt about premeditation. As the prosecution prepared for trial, a final technological breakthrough arrived from an unexpected source. In July 2009, a wildlife researcher reviewing archived footage from motion-activated cameras placed throughout Cascade River State Park discovered images of a man matching Lester's description entering the park on foot at 7:32 a.m. on October 15th, hours before Bryce disappeared. The man carried a backpack identical to the one found in the park 3 days later. This evidence suggested that Lester had planted Bryce's backpack in the park that morning, deliberately creating a false lead to suggest Bryce had run away or met with foul play there rather than at the truck stop. That was the final piece of the technological puzzle, Prosecutor Simmons noted. It showed that Lester had constructed an elaborate plan to mislead investigators from the very beginning, creating a false timeline and location to draw attention away from his actual movements that afternoon. On August 3, 2009, as the prosecution presented this overwhelming body of digital evidence to Lester and his defense attorney during a pre-trial conference, the facade finally cracked. Confronted with the irrefutable technological proof of his guilt, the enhanced security footage, the cell tower data mapping his movements, the financial records showing his motive, and the damning email drafts outlining his plan, Reed Lester's carefully constructed alibi collapsed completely. I've never seen someone physically deflate the way Lester did when we showed him the recovered footage from Camera 7, Detective Holt recalled. It was as if he suddenly realized that technology had advanced just enough in those 17 months to expose every aspect of his crime. The defense attorney requested a brief recess, and when they returned, Lester indicated he was willing to provide a full confession in exchange for the prosecution taking the death penalty off the table. District Attorney Eleanor Simmons agreed to the terms, and on August 4, 2009, in a recorded interview that would last nearly 6 hours, Reed Lester finally revealed the complete story of what happened to Bryce Mitchell on that autumn afternoon, a confession that would answer the remaining questions but shock investigators with its cold calculation and complete lack of remorse. As Lester began to speak, detectives activated the recording equipment, knowing that the technology that had tracked his digital footprints across Oregon would now capture the final piece of evidence, the killer's own words, describing exactly how and why he had murdered his 14-year-old stepson. The interrogation room at the Rockford County Sheriff's Office was austere by design, windowless with pale green walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, and 3 chairs. On August 4, 2009, this Spartan space became the setting for one of the most chilling confessions in Oregon's criminal history. Reed Lester, dressed in an orange jumpsuit and looking considerably thinner than when he had been arrested 5 months earlier, sat across from Detective Vanessa Holt and FBI agent Troy Navarro as recording equipment documented his every word. "I want to be clear about something before we start," Lester said, his voice steady and clinical. "I'm not doing this out of remorse. I'm doing this because your evidence makes continuing to deny it pointless. I want the record to reflect that this confession is solely in exchange for taking the death penalty off the table. This opening statement set the tone for what would become a 6-hour confession, remarkable not only for its detail, but for the complete absence of emotion or empathy displayed by the confessant. As prosecutor Eleanor Simmons would later note, in 20 years of prosecuting homicides, I've never encountered a confession so thorough, yet so utterly devoid of human feeling. Lester began by explaining that his plan to kill Bryce had formed gradually over the summer of 2007, driven by a confluence of financial pressures. His embezzlement from Cascade Timber Equipment had reached a critical point, with the company's financial controller beginning to notice discrepancies in sales commissions. Simultaneously, he had accumulated substantial gambling debts at casinos in Washington and Nevada, a secret addiction he had hidden from Diane. The insurance policy was the obvious solution, Lester stated with disturbing pragmatism. I researched various scenarios and determined that a missing teenager case presented the optimal risk-reward ratio. If no body was found, the insurance would pay out after 7 years. If remains were eventually discovered, it would appear as a tragic random crime with no obvious suspect. The methodical planning that followed was meticulous. Lester purchased the remote property near Fossil through a cash transaction with a private seller, ensuring minimal documentation. He studied the behaviors and routines of violent offenders who had successfully evaded capture, focusing on methods of concealing evidence. Most disturbingly, he began subtly manipulating family dynamics to create a plausible narrative of a troubled teenager who might run away. I deliberately created tension between Bryce and Diane, Lester admitted. I would tell her that Bryce had said disrespectful things about her when she wasn't around, and I told him that she was frustrated with his grades and attitude. Neither was true, but it created an environment where a sudden disappearance wouldn't seem completely unexpected. The confession revealed that October 15th was chosen specifically because it was one of the rare days when Lester knew Diane would be working late at the hospital where she was employed as a nurse administrator. This would give him several hours before her return home at 8:30 p.m., time he needed to execute his plan and establish his alibi. The morning of October 15th, Lester drove to Cascade River State Park at 7:15 a.m., well before his workday was supposed to begin. He planted Bryce's backpack, which he had taken from the teenager's room days earlier and filled with school materials and personal items, deep in the park. This false evidence was intended to direct the eventual search away from the actual crime scene. I texted Bryce throughout the morning, pretending to be concerned about an argument he'd had with Diane the night before, Lester continued. There had been no argument, but I wanted to establish a digital record suggesting family tension. I told him I wanted to talk things through and would pick him up after school. The plan hit its first complication when Bryce responded that he was planning to stay late for a photography club meeting. Lester countered by telling him that his mother was extremely upset and had asked Lester to mediate a conversation that evening. Again, this was a fabrication, but it created urgency and obligation. Lester then described leaving work at approximately 2:30 p.m., telling colleagues he had a sales meeting in Portland. Instead, he drove to a location near Rockford High School, intending to intercept Bryce as he left the building. When Bryce didn't appear at the expected time, Lester began driving along the routes his stepson typically took, growing increasingly concerned that his carefully orchestrated timeline would be disrupted. I spotted him walking toward Miller's gas station just after 3:15, Lester recounted. I parked across the street and watched him withdraw money from the ATM. That's when I realized he was planning to run away. He had his backpack with him, but not the one I'd planted in the park. This was a different bag. This unexpected development forced Lester to improvise. He followed Bryce at a distance as the teenager walked to Pearson's truck stop. When Bryce entered the building, Lester parked and went inside, confronting his stepson near the payphones. He was surprised to see me, obviously, Lester stated. I told him his mother was worried and that we needed to go home and sort things out. He seemed suspicious but came with me initially. It was only when we got to the car that he started to resist. What followed was a struggle in the parking lot, the confrontation captured on the security cameras that had become key evidence. Lester admitted to forcing Bryce into the Explorer and driving east out of town. When Bryce threatened to report him for assault, Lester made the split-second decision to accelerate his timeline. The original plan was to take him to the Fossil property, where everything was prepared, Lester explained with disturbing detachment. But his threats changed the equation. I pulled over on a service road about 20 minutes outside of Rockford and used a pre-prepared syringe of sedative I'd obtained from Diane's hospital supplies. The confession then detailed how Lester administered a powerful sedative to subdue Bryce before continuing the drive to the remote property. Once there, with Bryce unconscious but still breathing, Lester described carrying him to the pre-dug gravesite. "I used a rock from the creek bed," Lester stated flatly. "One blow to the back of the head. It was quick. He didn't regain consciousness." The medical examiner would later confirm that blunt force trauma was indeed the cause of death, with evidence suggesting Bryce had been unconscious but alive when the fatal blow was delivered. After burying the body, Lester collected Bryce's personal effects, phone, wallet and watch, and meticulously cleaned the Explorer using cleaning supplies he had brought for that purpose. He then drove to Portland, establishing part of his alibi by making a credit card purchase at a gas station before returning to Rockford. "I disposed of his phone on the way back by throwing it from the highway bridge near milepost 47, Lester added, explaining the location where the damaged phone had eventually been found by the highway maintenance worker months later. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the confession came when Agent Navarro asked about Lester's feelings during the crime. "I didn't feel anything in particular," he responded. "It was like completing a complicated work project, a series of logistical challenges to overcome. I wasn't angry at Bryce. He was simply the means to solving my financial problems." This emotional detachment extended to his description of returning home that evening and informing Diane that he hadn't seen Bryce. He participated in her growing concern as hours passed, even making a show of calling Bryce's friends, while knowing exactly why the teenager wasn't responding. "The hardest part was maintaining the concerned stepfather role," Lester admitted. "Not because I felt genuine concern, but because it required constant attention to details, what I should know versus what I shouldn't know, how worried to appear, when to suggest calling the police. It was exhausting to calibrate those reactions precisely." The confession also revealed Lester's actions in the months following the murder. He regularly visited the fossil property to ensure the grave remained undisturbed, carefully monitoring the site for any signs of animal activity or erosion that might expose the remains. He described systematically disposing of additional evidence, including the clothes he had worn during the crime and the sedative container, at various locations across 3 counties. When asked about Diane's death by apparent overdose in 2008, Lester maintained that it had been accidental. However, he acknowledged exploiting the tragedy financially by quickly claiming her life insurance and selling their home. "Her death was convenient," he stated, a comment that prompted further investigation into Diane's overdose, though no evidence of foul play was ever definitively established. As the marathon confession approached its 6th hour, Detective Holt asked the question that had haunted the investigation from the beginning. Why Bryce? Why not just divorce Diane or find some other way to solve your financial problems? Lester's response encapsulated the cold calculation that had characterized the entire crime. Insurance doesn't pay out for divorce, and Bryce's policy had the fewest complications. No autopsy if no body was found, no suspicion of suicide given his age and temperament, and the highest payout relative to premium costs. It was simply the most efficient solution. The recording ended at 8:42 p.m., with Lester signing a written statement, affirming that his confession was given voluntarily. As he was led back to his cell, he made a final comment to Detective Holt that would later be included in her final report. "The only mistake I made was underestimating how quickly surveillance technology would advance. If I'd waited another year to do it, those cameras would have been digital with cloud storage, and you'd have had the footage immediately. Timing is everything." Following the confession, prosecutors formalized the plea agreement. Reed Lester would plead guilty to first-degree murder, kidnapping and insurance fraud in exchange for a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, avoiding the death penalty. On September 18, 2009, nearly 2 years after Bryce Mitchell disappeared from Rockford, Reed Lester stood before Judge Arthur Callahan in the Rockford County Courthouse. As the charges were read and the details of his crimes recounted for the court record, Lester remained expressionless, showing the same emotional detachment that had characterized his confession. The court has rarely encountered a crime so calculating in its conception and so cold in its execution, Judge Callahan stated before pronouncing sentence. The defendant not only took the life of a child placed in his care, but did so with a level of premeditation that demonstrates a profound moral emptiness. As Reed Lester was led from the courtroom to begin his life sentence at the Eastern Oregon Correctional Institution, the technological evidence that had exposed his crimes, enhanced security footage, cellular data, digital financial records, and recovered internet searches had established a new precedent for how cold cases could be solved through advances in forensic technology. For Detective Vanessa Holt, the resolution brought professional validation but little emotional closure. "The technology gave us the tools to find the truth," she later reflected, "but no technological advancement can make sense of the kind of calculated evil we encountered in this case. Some mysteries we can solve with science, others, like how a person can plan the murder of a child in their care with such detachment, may always remain beyond our understanding." The case of Bryce Mitchell's murder would go on to become a foundational study in forensic technology courses across the country, demonstrating how digital breadcrumbs, invisible to investigators in 2007, became clearly visible by 2009 through rapid advances in evidence recovery and analysis. But for the people of Rockford, Oregon, the technological triumph was overshadowed by the human tragedy of a community that had harbored a predator who presented himself as a concerned parent while calculating the financial value of his stepson's life. The Eastern Oregon Correctional Institution in Pendleton stood as a stark monument to consequence, a sprawling complex of concrete and steel set against the rolling wheat fields of Umatilla County. Behind its imposing walls, Reed Lester began serving his life sentence in October 2009, assigned to a maximum security unit reserved for the most notorious offenders. For the residents of Rockford, however, Lester's incarceration marked not an ending, but the beginning of a complex process of community healing and legal reckoning. The trial of Reed Lester, though abbreviated by his confession and plea agreement, had drawn national media attention. Court TV had broadcast the sentencing hearing live, and major news outlets published detailed accounts of the calculated murder that had initially masqueraded as a missing person case. This publicity brought both unwanted scrutiny to Rockford and renewed interest in the technological methods that had ultimately solved the case. On November 15, 2009, exactly 1 month after Lester began serving his sentence, prosecutor Eleanor Simmons held a comprehensive press conference to present the evidence that had led to his conviction. The presentation served both to satisfy public interest and to establish a methodological template for similar cases nationwide. The Mitchell case represents a watershed moment in how we approach cold cases, Simmons explained to the assembled journalists. It demonstrates that time, rather than being the perpetrator's ally, can actually work against them as technology evolves to reveal evidence that was initially invisible to investigators. The prosecution's presentation included a meticulously assembled timeline integrating physical evidence, digital forensics, financial records, and witness testimonies. Central to this presentation was what investigators had come to call the technological trinity, the enhanced security footage showing Lester forcing Bryce into his vehicle, the cell tower data mapping their movements on October 15, 2007, and the recovered internet searches documenting Lester's premeditation. Dr. Sofia Ramirez, the digital forensics expert whose algorithms had recovered the crucial security footage, provided a detailed explanation of how technological advances had transformed the investigation. In 2007, when Bryce first disappeared, video enhancement capabilities were primitive by today's standards, Dr. Ramirez noted. The technology to recover corrupted footage, isolate specific frames, and enhance image quality to identify individuals and license plates simply wasn't available to most law enforcement agencies. By 2009, those capabilities had advanced dramatically, turning what would have been unusable evidence into decisive proof. The press conference also addressed the financial aspects of the crime that had been fully revealed only after Lester's confession. Forensic accountant Andrea Torres presented a comprehensive analysis of Lester's embezzlement scheme at Cascade Timber Equipment, documenting how he had manipulated sales records to divert nearly $200,000 over 2 years. Financial crimes often serve as the foundation for violent crimes, Torres explained. In this case, the embezzlement created a ticking clock. Lester knew an audit would expose his theft, potentially leading to criminal charges. This financial pressure was the catalyst for his plan to murder Bryce and collect the insurance money. Most compelling was the presentation of Bryce's life insurance policy, which Lester had taken out just 3 months before the murder. The policy contained unusual provisions that Lester had specifically requested: a higher-than-standard death benefit for a minor, an accelerated payout clause for death by accident or misadventure, and a provision allowing for declaration of death after just 2 years if the insured was missing and foul play was suspected. These customized terms revealed the premeditated nature of Lester's plan and raised serious questions about insurance industry practices. The policy itself was essentially designed as an accomplice to murder, Simmons stated. The fact that an insurance company approved these terms without significant questioning represents a critical failure of oversight. This aspect of the case prompted immediate regulatory response. By December 2009, the Oregon Insurance Commissioner had launched a formal investigation into the company that had issued Bryce's policy, resulting in substantial fines for procedural violations and new statewide regulations requiring enhanced scrutiny of life insurance policies for minors, particularly those requested by step-parents or legal guardians, rather than biological parents. Beyond the regulatory impact, the Mitchell case fundamentally transformed police procedures across Oregon. In January 2010, the Oregon State Police established the Digital Evidence Recovery Unit, DRU, a specialized team equipped with the latest technology for recovering and analyzing electronic evidence. Detective Vanessa Holt was offered the position of directing this new unit, bringing her experience from the Mitchell case to train a new generation of digital forensic investigators. What we learned from Bryce's case is that physical evidence is increasingly intertwined with digital footprints, Holt explained in an interview marking the unit's establishment. Modern crimes leave electronic traces that may not be immediately visible but become accessible as technology advances. Our job is to ensure that time works for justice, not against it. The legal proceedings continued well beyond Lester's sentencing. In March 2010, Martin Mitchell, Bryce's biological father, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the insurance company that had issued the policy, Cascade Timber Equipment, for negligent oversight of Lester's financial activities, and Pearson's truck stop for failure to preserve and report potentially vital security footage. The civil case resulted in a landmark decision by the Oregon Supreme Court regarding the responsibilities of businesses to maintain and review security footage in cases of suspected criminal activity. The court's ruling established new precedent requiring businesses with surveillance systems to preserve recordings for a minimum of 90 days and to implement protocols for reviewing footage that might contain evidence of crimes. If Pearson's truck stop had reviewed their security footage within days of Bryce's disappearance, rather than storing it forgotten on a hard drive, Reed Lester might have been apprehended much sooner, the court noted in its decision. With this power of surveillance comes the responsibility to ensure it serves the public good. The Mitchell case also had profound psychological impacts on the Rockford community. The betrayal by someone who had presented himself as a concerned parent shattered the sense of safety many residents had taken for granted. In response, community leaders established the Bryce Mitchell Foundation for Child Safety, an organization dedicated to educating families about recognizing warning signs of potential harm to children, particularly in blended family situations. The most dangerous predators are those who appear completely normal, noted Dr. Eleanor Reynolds, a forensic psychologist who consulted on the case and later joined the Foundation's board. Reed Lester's personality profile reveals classic traits of psychopathy: superficial charm, lack of empathy, calculated manipulation, and an ability to mimic appropriate emotional responses without actually feeling them. These characteristics allowed him to integrate into the community while planning an unthinkable crime. The Foundation's work extended beyond education to advocacy for legislative change. In 2011, largely due to the Foundation's efforts, the Oregon legislature passed Bryce's Law, comprehensive legislation requiring enhanced background checks for step-parents seeking life insurance policies on minor children, mandating judicial review of large policies for minors, and establishing a statewide digital evidence repository to ensure that crucial electronic data in criminal cases would not be lost due to technological limitations of local police departments. One of the most poignant aspects of the aftermath came through the testimony of Bryce's friends and teachers at Reed Lester's sentencing hearing. Their statements painted a portrait of a thoughtful, creative teenager whose passion for photography had been blossoming in the months before his death. Bryce saw the world differently through his camera lens, said Eleanor Prentice, his math teacher. He found beauty and meaning in everyday moments that most people would overlook. The tragedy isn't just that his life was cut short, but that the world has been deprived of the unique perspective he would have contributed. Jason Cooper, Bryce's closest friend, established a photography scholarship in his memory at Rockford High School. The annual award provides camera equipment and mentorship to students interested in visual storytelling, ensuring that Bryce's artistic legacy continues through new generations of photographers. Bryce once told me that photography is about capturing moments that would otherwise be forgotten, Cooper said during the scholarship's inaugural presentation in 2010. The irony is that through this scholarship and the changes resulting from his case, Bryce himself will never be forgotten. His story has permanently changed how we protect children and how we use technology to solve crimes. For Detective Vanessa Holt, the resolution of the case brought professional accolades, but also a profound sense of responsibility. Her work on the Mitchell investigation made her a sought-after speaker at law enforcement conferences nationwide, where she emphasized the importance of persistence in cold cases and openness to emerging technological solutions. The technology that solved Bryce's case didn't exist when he disappeared, Holt frequently noted in her presentations. The lesson for investigators is never to consider a case truly cold, just temporarily unsolved until technology or new evidence provides the breakthrough we need. In a development that brought a measure of closure to many in the community, Martin Mitchell returned to Rockford in 2012 to establish a permanent memorial for his son. Rather than a traditional grave marker, he created the Bryce Mitchell Memorial Observatory at Cascade River State Park, a small astronomical facility equipped with telescopes and cameras, open to the public, and particularly focused on introducing young people to astronomy and photography. Bryce always looked up at the stars with wonder, Martin explained at the observatory's dedication. This place allows his spirit of curiosity and exploration to inspire others. It transforms a location associated with deception into a place of discovery and truth. The observatory quickly became a popular educational destination for school groups across Oregon. Its walls featured not only astronomical images, but also photographs taken by Bryce during his short life, carefully preserved by his father, and revealing a talented young artist whose perspective had been silenced too soon. As for Reed Lester, his life imprisonment proceeded without the public attention he had so carefully avoided during his 17 months of freedom following Bryce's murder. In prison, he maintained the same emotional detachment that had characterized his confession, participating minimally in required programs and declining all media interview requests. Psychiatric evaluations conducted during his incarceration consistently identified severe antisocial personality disorder with pronounced psychopathic traits. The tragedy of this case extends beyond Bryce's death, Dr. Reynolds observed 5 years after Lester's conviction. It demonstrates how our communities remain vulnerable to predators who understand and exploit social norms to appear trustworthy while harboring the darkest intentions. The technological evidence that convicted Reed Lester is less disturbing than the social mask he maintained so effectively. By 2015, the Bryce Mitchell case had become standard curriculum in criminal justice programs nationwide, examined for its insights into digital forensics, familial homicide patterns, and the intersection of financial crimes with violent offenses. Law enforcement agencies across the country had implemented protocols for preserving digital evidence based directly on lessons learned from the investigation. On October 15, 2017, exactly 10 years after Bryce's disappearance, the community of Rockford held a commemorative service at the observatory that bore his name. Detective Vanessa Holt, by then the director of Oregon's Digital Evidence Unit, addressed the gathering with a reflection on how the case had transformed both investigative practices and community awareness. 10 years ago, a calculated act of evil took Bryce from us, Holt said. But in the decades since, his case has protected countless other children through the changes it inspired in our laws, our technology, and our vigilance. A killer believed technology would help conceal his crime, but instead, advancing technology revealed the truth and continues to strengthen our ability to find justice for victims who cannot speak for themselves. As night fell over the observatory, attendees were invited to view the stars through the facility's telescopes. The the same stars that had once captivated a 14-year-old boy with a camera and a unique way of seeing the world. Above them, a small plaque bore an inscription chosen by Martin Mitchell, words taken from one of Bryce's school photography assignments discovered during the investigation. The camera doesn't just record what happened, it shows us what we missed the first time we looked. Sometimes the most important details are hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. For the people of Rockford, Oregon, those words had taken on a meaning their author could never have anticipated, becoming both a memorial to a life cut short and a testament to the persistence of truth in the face of calculated deception. The technological breakthrough that had finally brought justice for Bryce Mitchell had transformed a small-town tragedy into a national legacy of enhanced protection for children and advanced methods for solving the most carefully planned crimes. In the end, the case of the disappearance in Oregon demonstrated that while technology continues to evolve, the human impact of justice, delayed but ultimately delivered, remains its most profound application. Behind all the digital evidence, enhanced footage, and forensic advancements was a fundamental truth that no crime, no matter how carefully planned, can truly remain hidden forever when technology and human determination combine in the pursuit of justice. 10 years after Reed Lester began serving his life sentence, the ripple effects of the Bryce Mitchell case continued to expand through the criminal justice system, technology development, and community safety initiatives across the United States. What had begun as a local tragedy in a small Oregon logging town had evolved into a case study with national implications, fundamentally altering how missing persons cases were investigated and how digital evidence was preserved and analyzed. In October 2019, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit published a comprehensive study of the case titled "The Digital Predator: Lessons from the Mitchell Homicide," examining not only the technological aspects of the investigation, but also the psychological profile of Reed Lester. The study identified what investigators termed the perfect storm factors, the combination of psychopathic personality traits, financial pressure, family access, and technological overconfidence that had characterized Lester's crime. What makes the Mitchell case particularly instructive, the report noted, is how it represents a transitional moment in criminal investigation. Lester committed his crime in an era where digital evidence was already being created, but before law enforcement had fully developed the tools to recover and analyze it effectively. This timing created a dangerous confidence in his ability to escape detection, a confidence that advancing technology ultimately shattered. The study became required reading at the FBI Academy and police training centers nationwide, with the case's timeline frequently used to demonstrate how evolving technology can reveal previously invisible evidence. In a particularly telling development, the security footage from Pearson's truck stop, once barely discernible but later enhanced to provide crucial identification, became a standard training tool, showing side-by-side comparisons of the original grainy images and the enhanced versions that helped secure Lester's conviction. By 2020, the technological methods pioneered in the Mitchell investigation had become standard procedure in cold case units across the country. The Oregon Digital Evidence Recovery Unit, founded in response to the case, had grown into one of the nation's premier forensic technology centers, consulted by law enforcement agencies nationwide on complex digital evidence recovery. Detective Vanessa Holt, who had risen to become the unit's director and eventually Assistant Commissioner for Forensic Services at the Oregon State Police, reflected on this evolution in her 2020 memoir, Invisible Traces: How Technology Reveals Truth. Hi Stan, when I began investigating Bryce's disappearance in 2007, we were printing cell phone records on paper and manually plotting tower connections on physical maps, Holt wrote. By the time we arrested Reed Lester in 2009, we were using specialized software to create dynamic visualizations of movement patterns based on digital data. Today, artificial intelligence systems can analyze terabytes of surveillance footage in hours, identifying faces, vehicles, and anomalous behaviors that human investigators might miss entirely. This technological progression was dramatically illustrated in 2021 when the Oregon State Police used AI-enhanced analysis of historical satellite imagery to locate the remains of 3 missing persons in cases dating back to the 1990s, an application directly inspired by techniques developed during the Mitchell investigation. The legal framework surrounding digital evidence had evolved similarly. In 2018, the United States Supreme Court cited the Mitchell case in a landmark decision, establishing that digital data from security systems, cell towers, and internet service providers constituted a distinct category of evidence requiring specific preservation protocols. The ruling, which legal scholars dubbed the Mitchell Doctrine, established national standards for how such evidence must be collected, preserved, and authenticated to be admissible in court. Insurance industry practices had undergone their own transformation. The Bryce-Mitchell Insurance Protocols, adopted by 47 states by 2022, created stringent regulations for life insurance policies on minors, particularly those initiated by non-biological parents or guardians. These regulations required extensive background checks, financial reviews, and mandatory waiting periods for policies above certain values. Industry analysts credited these changes with significantly reducing insurance-motivated familial crimes against children. Perhaps the most profound legacy emerged in the field of child protection. The Bryce-Mitchell Foundation, initially established to address safety in blended families, had expanded its mission to include technological safety education for children and parents. By its 15th anniversary in 2024, the foundation had developed educational programs reaching over 3 million students nationwide, teaching age-appropriate vigilance without fostering undue fear. The goal isn't to make children afraid of trusted adults, explained Dr. Elena Reynolds, who had become the Foundation's executive director after retiring from her forensic psychology practice. Rather, it's to give them the tools to recognize and respond to subtle warning signs of manipulation and control, the very behaviors Reed Lester exhibited before escalating to violence. Martin Mitchell, who had remained in Rockford after establishing the Memorial Observatory for his son, became a powerful advocate for co-parenting rights and responsibilities. His work led to the establishment of the National Co-Parenting Communication Registry in 2023, a secure platform allowing divorced parents to document concerns about children's safety while providing neutral oversight to distinguish valid concerns from parental conflicts. If such a system had existed in 2007, Martin noted at the registry's launch, I might have been able to document patterns in Bryce's communications that indicated increasing control and isolation by his stepfather. The subtle shifts in his messages and calls contained warning signs that became obvious only in retrospect. Reed Lester himself remained a subject of ongoing psychological study. In 2020, he finally agreed to participate in a research project conducted by the Department of Justice examining the thought processes of individuals who commit premeditated familial homicide. The resulting interviews, conducted over 18 months, revealed a mind still devoid of remorse or empathy, but acutely aware of how technological advances had defeated his careful planning. I didn't account for exponential progress, Lester stated in one recorded session. I based my calculations on how long evidence analysis had historically taken, not on how quickly it was accelerating. By 2009, they could do in days what would have taken months in 2007. If I had understood that curve, I would have made different decisions. This cold calculus, unchanged after more than a decade in prison, reinforced for researchers the dangerous combination of high intelligence and severe psychopathy that had made Lester capable of planning and executing such a calculated crime against a child in his care. The town of Rockford itself had been permanently changed by the case. What had once been a close-knit community where neighbors rarely locked their doors had become more vigilant, but also more intentionally connected. Annual community safety forums, established in the wake of Lester's conviction, brought residents together not only to learn about physical and digital security, but also to strengthen the neighborhood bonds that create natural protection through familiarity and communication. Rockford High School, where Bryce had been a sophomore at the time of his murder, established an annual Digital Citizenship and Safety Week that became a model for schools nationwide. The curriculum, which evolved yearly to address emerging technologies, taught students not only about online safety, but also about the digital footprints created by everyday activities and how these could be either protective or problematic in different contexts. The Jason Cooper Photography Scholarship, named for Bryce's friend who had established it in his memory, had by 2025 supported the education of 28 young photographers, several of whom had gone on to careers in photojournalism and documentary filmmaking. The scholarship exhibition each year featured not only new work by current recipients, but also several of Bryce's own photographs, preserved by his father and teachers, ensuring that his artistic vision continued to reach new audiences. In September 2025, almost 18 years after Bryce's murder, the case received renewed attention when the Smithsonian Institution included it in a major exhibition titled Digital Justice: How Technology Transformed Criminal Investigation in the 21st Century. The exhibition featured interactive displays showing how the security footage, cell data, and internet searches in the Mitchell case had been analyzed and enhanced, allowing visitors to experience firsthand the technological progression that had ultimately revealed the truth. For Detective Vanessa Holt, by then approaching retirement after a distinguished career shaped significantly by the Mitchell investigation, the exhibition represented a fitting tribute to a case that had defined not only her professional life, but also an entire era in criminal justice. What began as the worst type of crime, the calculated murder of a child by someone entrusted with his care, ultimately produced an enduring legacy of protection and truth-finding, Holt observed during a panel discussion at the exhibition's opening. Every time a cold case is solved through digital evidence recovery, every time a child is protected through the insurance and co-parenting safeguards this case inspired, Bryce Mitchell's story continues to make a difference. The observatory bearing Bryce's name had become a beloved institution in Rockford and beyond. On clear nights, visitors could often find Martin Mitchell there, now grey-haired but still passionate about introducing young people to the wonders of astronomy and photography, the interests that had once captivated his son. When people look through these telescopes, they're seeing light that has traveled across the universe for years, decades, sometimes millions of years before reaching us, Martin explained to a school group during one such evening in 2025. It reminds us that truth has a way of persisting across time and distance, eventually becoming visible to those who keep watching and waiting for it. This persistence of truth, across time, through technology, and despite deliberate deception, had become the central theme of the Mitchell case's legacy. What Reed Lester had failed to understand when planning his crime was that digital evidence, unlike physical evidence, often becomes more rather than less accessible with the passage of time, as technological capabilities advance to reveal what was previously invisible. By 2025, this principle had been formalized in what criminologists called temporal evidence dynamics, the understanding that some forms of evidence deteriorate with time, while others become more accessible and analyzable. This concept, directly influenced by the Mitchell case, had transformed how investigators approach both new and cold cases, particularly those with digital components. Perhaps the most profound measure of the case's impact came not from legal precedents or technological advances, but from a simple statistic. In the 15 years following the implementation of Bryce's Law and the Mitchell insurance protocols, Oregon had not recorded a single case of a minor murdered by a step-parent for insurance proceeds, a category of crime that had occurred with troubling frequency in the years before 2007. For those who had known and loved Bryce Mitchell, this prevention of similar tragedies offered a measure of meaning amid the enduring grief of his loss. Though nothing could restore the life that had been taken or the potential that had been extinguished, the systemic changes inspired by his case had created a lasting protection for other children who might otherwise have faced similar dangers. On October 15, 2025, exactly 18 years after Bryce's disappearance, a small gathering assembled at the Memorial Observatory under a clear autumn sky. Among them were Detective Holt, now in her final year before retirement, Jason Cooper, who had maintained the photography scholarship through his own successful career as a photojournalist, and Martin Mitchell, who had devoted his life to ensuring his son's memory continued to inspire positive change. As darkness fell and the stars emerged above the observatory's dome, Martin activated a new digital display inside the facility, a virtual gallery showcasing both Bryce's original photographs and images created by all the scholarship recipients over the years. The presentation concluded with a quote from Bryce's journal, found during the investigation, and now serving as the observatory's motto: "Photography isn't about capturing what's obvious. It's about revealing what was always there but nobody noticed. Sometimes the most important truths are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to recognize their significance." In the nearly 2 decades since Reed Lester had calculated that technology would help him conceal his crime, That same technology had instead revealed every aspect of his deception, transformed criminal investigation practices nationwide, and ensured that Bryce Mitchell's brief life would have an enduring impact far beyond what anyone could have imagined on that autumn day in 2007, when a 14-year-old boy with a camera and a unique perspective disappeared from a small town in Oregon. The disappearance in Oregon had been solved not just through advancing technology, but through human determination to find the truth, a combination that had turned a tragedy into a legacy of protection, innovation, and justice that would continue to evolve long after those directly involved in the case had passed from the scene. As visitors to the Smithsonian exhibition in Washington, D.C., moved through the interactive displays detailing the technological breakthrough that had solved the case, they encountered a final panel bearing words that summed up the enduring lesson of Bryce Mitchell's case. In the digital age, the passage of time is no longer the criminal's ally, but often becomes the instrument of truth. What technology cannot yet reveal today, it may illuminate tomorrow. Justice, like the light from distant stars, may travel across time before finally becoming visible, but with patience and persistence, the truth will eventually emerge from the darkness.